free agency, because that's really what brought us all here together today as of this live on November 15th. The free agent period has been in process. It's been a work in progress. It made its arrival for the first time to the NWSL ever in this offseason. It's under the CBA that got kicked off this year ahead of the NWSL preseason. So beginning in the offseason, that players with at least 6 years of minimum service in the league, 5 years in 2024, can begin negotiations with any team within the league at the conclusion of their contract terms. So there was a little bit of a discrepancy at one point in October where things went to arbitration because there were players with option years on their contract. And the argument was that those players were technically not eligible for free agency, but the arbitrator ruled that the 22 players with options and the status was official. They could begin those negotiations. And we have a ton of players. Here we are now, Lisa, on the 15th. There's a deadline in place here today where we can see some news drop and see maybe some big names either re-sign with their current clubs or announce that they are going to a new team.
Yeah, today is the day. It's the first ever free agency period where it can now be announced. But I think that the chaos of it all, of course, with the arbitrator and can the players join and can they not? And there ultimately were 22 players that joined the list additionally with the other players. And when you look at the free agency list, there's a lot of players on this list, a lot of big name players. And I think it's also important to look at how many clubs are impacted and like significantly impacted. There's a couple from every club, right? There's 6-year plus veterans that, because that's what it is, 6 years of service in the league. In 2024, it'll be 5 years, and then moving up, it'll be 3 years. So that number is going to continue to go down for free agency. But when you look at the list, I think North Carolina wins with 8 players of free agency. Chicago has 7 players available for free agency. And then a bunch of others, 4 for Washington, Reign, Orlando. Like there's a lot of players on this list because of it. So with this option of free agency, new and current teams are now able to start negotiations. The player, the team, the player's agent, all of these things are happening right now. And if a player, the way that free agency is working, if a player does not receive a new offer, that they will remain a free agent with unassigned rights in the NWSL. But we've already seen some players re-signing with their current teams, right? Christine Sinclair was listed on this list. And that can happen at any time. There is no date specific timeline for that. And that's kind of what we're already seeing, because if you sign with a new team as a free agent, you cannot sign that new contract until November 15th. Today is the day that we will start to hear some of those new free agent contracts coming out, maybe.
I'm looking forward to it. You know, we started the top of this episode with a wish. At least I did. At least I think it's something new, right? Free agency hasn't existed before in the league's history. So I think everybody is, of course, they're going to want to see what's happening with a little bit of new excitement, right? This is just a new layer of things. I think in the past with NWSL offseason, there was always the possibility of big off-season news, right? It's just perhaps a contract had ended, and then maybe it was a player re-signing for a new contract, or just a trade window before in the past during an off-season versus the actual concept of free agency. So I'm looking at, sort of what is in front of us now versus what is yet to come. I mean, there have been players who were listed as free agents who have already announced, that they've resigned with their current club, that they were not pivoting to any other new club. I mean, and this was happening while the postseason was actually still occurring. I mean, we talked a bit about, Christine Sinclair already, and how she announced at the Thorns rally that she was going to be returning. But my goodness, we saw Houston Dash make their first ever NWSL postseason appearance. And although they got eliminated in the quarterfinals, something that they were ready to announce at their exiting was the re-signing of a Sophie Schmidt or an Alyssa Chapman, right? Canadian internationals who are going to remain with Houston moving forward. But this is just a handful, right, of players that we saw on that full list of eligible free agents. So I'm a little curious about how teams are going to look like and what they're going to look like if these negotiations are going to stay in place, because I'm also a little bit fixated on what you just shared as well. Like, what's going to happen to those rights, if there is someone who is unassigned, right? And it's just like, if there's no new offer in place, what type of layer of chaos does that introduce for the league in the off season? If things don't, if the I's don't get dotted or the T's don't get crossed.
But this is finally putting some power in the players' hands, which is something that players have been asking for and calling for. And that's why it was put in the CBA last year that was created. And it's why it was put into place this very first offseason that they could, because these players want to be able to not only negotiate their salaries and their pay and determine what they are worth themselves, not just what their contract says or what their agent could get for them. But it also really helps because these players now can choose where they want to live, choose where they want to spend their career and work and play professionally. And the fact that there are 12 teams now in the NWSL, it opens up that radius a little bit more, because there are teams now in California for players to go to, and there are teams in the Midwest. Like, there's a lot of freedom and flexibility. And we even saw that last year with the expansion draft. Some players saying, hey, yeah, I really wanted to go home to California. You look at a player like Kristen Press. She wanted to go home and play for LA. That's her hometown, a place she never thought she'd be able to play professionally. You look at Alex Morgan as well, playing for San Diego. I mean, that's where she wanted to play and that's where she wanted to be. So having this free agency allows those players the freedom and the flexibility to advocate for where they want to play. And when you look at this list, some of these players, you think, hey, are they maybe nearing the end, the final year or two of their career? I think that has to come into question, especially the players that have been in the league for 10 years. I mean, we just saw Ashlyn Harris retire last night. I know that Christine Sinclair has already announced she is returning to Portland, but that's also a big question mark. When is her time in club soccer going to end? I think she's going to end at Portland, right? Like, there are so many players on this list that you can kind of say, hey, if they want to go out and maybe this be their last 1 or 2 years, we might see them make a move, whether it's to their hometown where they're from, where their families are, where them and their families and their significant others want to settle down. Like, this is the moment for those players to make those trades. But as you mentioned, Christine Sinclair already re-signed. Ifeoma Onumonu re-signed with Gotham FC, as well as Taylor Smith has also re-signed with Gotham.
And Mandy Freeman.
And Mandy Freeman. So it's really Gotham, Houston, and Portland are the only teams that have re-signed players so far.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I think folks out there, if you're a fan of a specific club that maybe you're hanging on, if you notice that there are a number of players who were eligible in the club that you support for free agency, you're wondering as of now for November 15th, like, oh, why hasn't a re-signing been announced for player X, Y, or Z? Because if a player re-signed with their club at the time, that already could have been announced. The November 15th, 5 p.m. ET deadline is for public announcements for new contracts, right, that have been signed. And that's something I think that folks are keeping an eye on. So, like, it's cool that you mentioned Gotham, because this was one of those teams, that had a handful of players that were listed on their franchise with the free agent list. Chicago Red Stars, another team, a handful of players on there as well. I think maybe you could have made an argument, for North Carolina, who had a number of players.
8 for North Carolina, 7 for Chicago, 6 for Gotham. These are big numbers. It's a lot of players. I mean, you look at 7 players, 8 for North Carolina. That's like you're a third of your starting lineup. Even Chicago, 7. I mean, there's so many players that have been with Chicago for so long that are now on this list that we could see make moves.
Yeah, so we saw, for Chicago, one of those players in Nagasato, who was listed as a free agent. They announced that they've re-signed this player, so that's a familiar sort of fan favorite who is going to make their return to the Red Stars. But that's one of 7 players who were listed as eligible free agents on that list. So let's maybe have some fun with this, because as of right now, there hasn't been, and us doing this recording and joining everybody live, there hasn't been that sort of big bombshell deadline day kind of announcement. So let's have a little bit of fun in terms of what is in front of us. For you, Lisa, who is like the 1 or 2 or possibly even 3 like really big names on this free agent list that you think teams are trying to target?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of big names, so I'm not going to give you just one. I think like when I go down the list of free agents, I think Dabinia is a player that is huge on this list with North Carolina. She just controls the midfield. She controls a lot of it. And as a Brazilian international, any team would be stellar to pick her up. But it changes the way that you're going to play. So you can't just get a player like Dabinia. It comes with a high price point at that point. And also then the team kind of needs to shift their tactics as how they're playing in the midfield, depending on the other players they have, because you center your midfield around a player like Dabinia. So not every team is going to want a player like Dabinia, not because she's not talented and not because she's not going to help your team win and get goals. We saw the tear that Dabinia went on last year with North Carolina, but because then it changed the style of the team and kind of what they're going at. So I think Dabinia is a big name player on here that you definitely have to circle, because where she ends up, whether she stays in North Carolina, but she's negotiating a bigger contract, or if she moves, that'll change how I look at a team, right? Like say she goes to a team like Washington Spirit, that they're going to change their midfield and how they play. I think when you also look down this list, another big time player is Kelly O'Hara, formerly with Washington the last couple of years. Where this player ends up is a big question mark at this point, because this is a player that you can also kind of build your team around in terms of leadership. If you look at where Kelly O'Hara was last year with Washington Spirit and that 2021 team that went on to win the NWSL championship, it's thanks to a player like O'Hara, who can be a veteran and be a leader on the back line. And yeah, dealing with a bit of injuries, I think that's also a concern, a point of concern with a player like Kelly O'Hara. So when I talked about, hey, where these players may be looking to retire, I think that's where we could see someone like Kelly O'Hara coming into place and making those decisions. Not that she's retiring anytime soon, but you have to kind of think about, hey, where do you want to spend the last couple of years of your career, and then maybe settle down in that location.
Can't sound the alarms, right?
No,
Sending folks into a panic. Lisa Roman,
even like
retirement news ahead of the World Cup.
Yeah, no, don't worry. I'm not causing panic at this point. But like McCall Zerboni also on this list, like Denise O'Sullivan, like there are just some really, really big name players. What about you? When you look at this free agency list, specifically Chicago, with the 7 players that they have named here, any names jump out at you that you think, hey, they could be headed somewhere else at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think Chicago is a unique situation in terms of the players that are on this free agent list. A couple of them are players who have played their entire professional careers in Chicago. So I would imagine that any negotiating or conversations around player movement, I would hope that they're actually player first, just considering the last 2 years around the franchise. Like, that you want to have those conversations with players, like, and be very upfront about it. Like, do you want to stay? We saw pretty much a bit of a mass exodus for the Red Stars just one off season ago, post their 2021 championship finals appearance. So I think with free agency, it's a little bit different in terms of, comparing one off season to this off season where there was just trade windows and opportunity for movement, conversations, check-ins, and then trying to make those requests and trying to fulfill those player requests. Now with something like free agency, there's actual contract, timeline, money involved. It's a little bit different, right? So I would imagine that having that many players, you're already perhaps a little bit tied with what you can actually make happen as a franchise. That is a lot of players to try to say we're going to retain all of them. I would imagine that they're going to try their best to retain some of them, but I don't anticipate all 7 of Chicago's free agents will return as Red Star players. I think
so the list for those joining us live and listening, the list of Chicago players on free agents: Danielle Colaprico, Vanessa DiBernardo, Morgan Gautrat, Rachel Hill, Yuki Nagasato, who is returning, Kalia Watt, and Aaron Wright.
Yeah, so I would anticipate in terms of those players, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody like a Colaprico makes a move or is a player that is a target for other teams. I mean, you're talking about a veteran NWSL midfielder, someone who has that can bring that league experience to any team and immediately bulk up a middle third for you. I think if your team that had some targeted areas in your middle third, you're looking at a player like Colaprico and trying to sign her to your franchise. I look at a team like Angel City. I look at a team like San Diego. I look at the California teams, but I wouldn't be surprised if, like you said, there are players on this list who have been in the NWSL for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think
some that go beyond the 6 year of service quota for this CBA. So you've got a player like Aaron Wright or a player like Vanessa DiBernardo or a player like Tani Colaprico who have been with one franchise since they have been drafted into this league. And we're talking about draft days that go back to 2014 and 2015. So you're talking decade-long experiences with these franchises. So I would imagine, again, that you can maybe try to keep some of them. You've got somebody like DiBernardo who has local ties to Chicago. You've got somebody like an Aaron Wright who really has sort of dove into feet first into Chicago, got married, has a son, has a family, has roots now in Chicago, and then looking at somebody like a Nagasato who specifically wanted to make a return to the Red Stars, right? From last season.
Yeah.
So, I think that Colaprico is a likely target for to move. And listen, I think if you're looking to bulk up your middle third, if you're Angel City, if you're San Diego, if you're Gotham specifically, you're looking to make a move and try to sign a player like Colaprico. I think that might be the player that they have a hard time hanging on to.
I think you made a really good point that it's not just players moving, but also teams poaching players, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's where the salary negotiations come in, especially when, I mean, you mentioned it with Colaprico that she's such a prolific player in the midfield, and she's also very versatile. So she can flex in and out of different systems and different midfields and still be a big contributor in terms of what she's going to do consistently. So like the poaching of players is also where this comes in. So maybe a player wasn't thinking, hey, I'm going to be moving to California, but they were like, I'm good where I am. I'm going to stay. And then one of another teams comes calling and they give them an offer they can't refuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, listen, I think you're spot on in terms of this current free agent list. It's Debinha. I think for me, she is like the S ranked, not even A ranked. She's the S ranked free agent on this list, and North Carolina, that other franchise with a handful of players that they have to try to either retain or negotiate deals with. And they did that in a certain capacity, right? We talked about Smith, we talked about Anumanu, we talked about Freeman as some of those players who have been re-signed. Are they going to try? Is this a franchise that's going to try to make a move for a different player? I mean, Estelle Johnson was one of these players tied to Gotham that was, listed as a free agent. This was not a player that they have announced that they have made this re-signing with. So what's going to happen there? But yeah, Davinia, for me, this is a global talent. I mean, we're talking about a player on a deadline day who's not even, in the country right now. She's busy playing with Brazil against Canada during this international window, right? Got a goal in that 2-1 loss, but that is the caliber of player that Davinia is. And I think of all of the free agents on this list, this is the player that if you are a franchise who is trying to target or lure this player to sign with your franchise, you are absolutely throwing everything that you can
everything at the wall. Yeah. With honestly, everything that you can, but she knows what she's worth. She knows, honestly, the players that she's playing around. And then it also comes into a factor of how much money do these teams actually have to give these players? Because you look at some of the contracts already signed, right? I mean, you look at Trinity Rodman with a $1.1 million contract at Washington Spirit. So, does that change what Washington's willing to do? Maybe they can't keep as many players as they wanted because they have a big contract. And it really comes down to how you're allocating this money and which teams have the money to actually get some of these big name players and make them an offer you can't refuse. Big name player like Davinia, who can actually afford her, and maybe you don't get anyone else. Oh, I love it. The chaos is already happening for me, just us talking about this and everything that could happen.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Listen, the next time we get together, we'll probably have some official contracts to talk about, some new signings that we've got to highlight, and maybe we'll rank them. Maybe we'll talk about who swung and who got the hit and who got the miss. You'll have to stay tuned. I know we're going to be keeping an eye on everything as free agency continues